All right.
All right. So back in business. So I've been thinking more as these things go on what we've been doing. Last time we talked about discovering that contacting when trying to contact an open source project that an account might have been compromised, for example. Wait, not when contacting, that you somehow find out it's compromised and you want to communicate that. And then browsing a little bit more in the file here, there's a bunch of more, let's call it ecosystem messages, or I mean, messages to be shared from the perspective or from the ecosystem side that the ecosystem folks may have discovered. That made me think we're trying to solve several things at the same time here, and maybe we need to kind of give this a little bit of a think again, a few calories. Say, for example, one of the requirements I've added along the way here is metadata file must be both useful for project and ecosystem-centric communities. And in addition to that, we also have one new use case that we have barely mentioned, and that is open source meetup communities, which is kind of project related, but doesn't have to be. Like if the open source project is a programming language, then that's something that happens. Like I've been to Ruby meetups and Python meetups and Perl meetups, lots of Perl meetups. So having those kind of community efforts and resources going on is definitely an open source thing, but we're mainly talking about something that can be put in a repository, most likely. And then the question is, if, say, for example, somebody who does like a community who doesn't have a repository, they might just have a meetup.com page. Even if that's something which has become less desirable lately because they are trying to monetize the whole thing quite aggressively. But even if there's similar other like systems going, some similar ways to organize meetups in Fediverse, for example, if that's something that will show up eventually, the same problem will come up there. Like, how can we communicate that we'd like to have help organizing events? And in parallel with that, the ecosystem folks, which maybe when I've been talking with friends and colleagues on this topic, sometimes they seem to be confused when I say ecosystem people, or is that, do you mean have a clear idea of what that means? Just to do a sanity check for my sake here.
I know what it means because I'm in the same or similar kind of bubble that you are.
Yeah.
I don't know if somebody outside of open source, and I don't know if they're not, well, I mean, this is for open source maintainers for the most part.
I think it's worth being clear on this point and just adding a definition to what we actually mean with that. So
yes.
So I've been trying to talk about a host, an ecosystem host. I don't know if that's a good term to use. I'm still trying to figure out good names for things, and I don't know what people call themselves. Like in the Perl community, we just call these people call themselves the toolchain gang, which doesn't say anything about the role they play in the greater picture of things. but what I am talking about when we when I talk about ecosystems, then I'm talking about the people and the communities that run the services and projects around the tooling that is required for an ecosystem to work. There's a website where you can download packages from. There's an API endpoint or another website where you can upload packages that you want to publish. There is tooling that you can use to download and resolve dependencies in order to build, test, and install the components that you depend on. And the people who write all of these things that are interconnected and all of it has to work in order to successfully use open source components. They are in my mind, the ecosystem people, or I could have said tool chain, but that's a very Perl centric way, and I'm not sure that's a healthy.
So I think we've got in a lot of cases, right? The ecosystem and the host are almost synonymous, like CPAN, for example, for Perl, or PyPy for Python, etc. But in other cases, the ecosystem and the host are actually different things. And I'll give you an example.
Okay.
You know, like Docker, right?
Yeah.
So if you're doing containers and container image development, while the technology is part of the ecosystem, right? We've got Docker files, we've got tools that do this. The actual host, because of business model changes that Docker decided to implement a couple of years ago, there's been a number of alternatives that have sprung up and in some cases have become more popular than Docker itself.
Right.
So in this case, you've got an ecosystem that actually has multiple hosts as options.
Right. Yeah, we do have. Okay, that's a good distinction, because in my mind, a host and ecosystem is very close. But now that you say this, hosting the artifacts, whether or not it's a container file that is being downloaded through some tooling, or a tarball or a zip file or whatever it is, you can have like usually what in my community we have like the one official one, cpan.org, but we also have backpan.org, which is the historic archive where you can get every old version of everything. And some people in Japan once created something called pre-pan, just to do early releases in safe environments, so people could get early access to alpha version of packages or something. I don't think that project exists anymore, but furthermore, we have also what we call dark pans. This is the Perl pan means Perl Archive Network, and the dark means it's not publicly available. It's something hidden inside a business or as an internal mirror with their custom packages that they use in their software as a way to just inject a mirror that talks the same protocols, that has the same file structures, where the index is found in this expected way, and where they can also inject their own fixes, including if they have to vendor some fixes or apply some patches. It's still available, and it's available across the whole organization for all the applications they run in a central place. It's almost having your own a company Debian mirror, for example. That's also something I've seen over the years. So that's possible, and the people inside the organization who have that service running will be the host of that archive.
Yep.
Still, that's what the question remains for me. What should we call the group or the loose community of projects and people that have something to do with making it all work? That's a word I don't know.
Well, two things come to mind. Ecosystem is one, and two would be technological community, where people kind of build community around a given technology.
Yeah, that's even worse than just ecosystem, in my opinion. Sorry.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just leave it at ecosystem.
yeah, but like ecosystem, like for me, there's a significant difference between package ecosystems and language ecosystems, and I would love if there was a way to distinguish them by having separate words instead of a qualifier. But maybe we'll have to just live with language ecosystem or a package ecosystem. And container ecosystem.
Yeah, and if we want to define these things, I think that's fine. As long as the definition is loose enough, because you're not going to be able to describe every possible, ecosystem, especially the ones that haven't been created yet.
Yeah. My point here is that these ecosystems, the language, package, and even container ecosystems might learn something about some of their upstream actors or players, or whatever we should call them, their upstream sources. And in front of this, which is often, for me, maybe we haven't talked about it, maybe it was a long time ago, but give me a moment here. A while back, for the CPAN security group, I put together like an overview of ecosystems. Let's see if, and with metadata around that. And just a simplified graph of this would be this one. And this is basically where does this is a graph that tries to show a picture of where metadata comes from. So at the top here would be some projects, open source project, and the environment, whatever that is. It could be a business, it could be a person sitting in the cellar in Nebraska, it could be an open source community project, it could be a hackathon, anything. And we have some Git and Git collaboration ecosystem, GitLab. And were there a couple more which I forgot. In old days, we used Subversion and had a collaboration overlay on top of that is what's called SVK, which made it possible to share Subversion files across the network and sync it up in the sense that were like Git does, but in a much less elegant way. So the moment Git appeared, then everybody moved to that. And the point here is that these systems here, the package ecosystems and the container ecosystem, each of them can learn about something happening with their upstreams, and the language ecosystems, and to some extent the package ecosystems, when there's no language ecosystem in between the users or the projects, and the distribution platform or the ecosystem, then they might discover something is going on, and they need to communicate that they have discovered something. And so the reason I'm raising this perspective now is, I'm wondering if we need to do a little bit of touching base here for a moment, because I'm a little bit afraid we're doing some scope creep. This is useful information, and I'm wondering, do we need a second file? Like right now, we're talking about one file you can drop in a project Git repository to describe the project's needs, which is fine. But an ecosystem doesn't have that. They don't have a repository in the same way that they can drop a file. And sure, we could have some transparency exchange API where you could upload some custom files, but even then, we need to have some idea of what they're called and what the role they play and how they interact and what you should expect in that file. So the problem persists. Is it our job to solve this problem? Some of it maybe. I'm not sure. So does it make sense what I'm saying here?
It does, and I think scope creep was probably a very relevant. I think I'd like to, if what we're doing, we've got a laundry list of different requirements and use cases and stuff. And if what we're doing is going to be useful to the 90%, of open source developers and maintainers, then, we should likely do it. I'm not necessarily interested in perfection. And because that usually requires boiling the ocean. It requires a tremendous amount of research and effort for that extra 10%.
Right.
And ultimately, you need to measure effort versus impact.
Yeah.
And if the amount of effort necessary to go that extra 10% is going to take longer than the entirety of the requirement itself, it's probably not worth it.
All right. So let's have a hard question for a moment. Should we put this requirement here? The metadata file must both be useful for project and ecosystem-centric communities. Is that too much should go? I think that it should be in, but we have to ask it. Is this? Should we try to make a file for the related metadata and states concerning the sustainability of our project that is dedicated for ecosystems in addition to the projects themselves? So, meaning that it could be the same spec that they're following, I don't know, or a separate spec, I don't know. Or should we skip that and let each ecosystem do their own thing as they've always done so? Is there a value in having a standardized way to communicate that an account has been closed and they cannot upload anymore because some compromise has happened, like they lost private certificates, for example, or something?
That's a good question. And honestly, I don't have enough insight into all the different ecosystems to know, how different they all are. I would imagine there's quite a bit of variance in how things are done. For example, over on Maven, it used to be, I'm not sure if it still is, but it used to be that you would have to file a JIRA ticket, and they had a whole process of validating who you are and all this other stuff, which is going to be very, very different than, how things are done over on PHP Composer, for example, or, something else, right? So I think what we might be able to do here is more of obviously it's got to be useful for the projects and be consumable by the ecosystems that those projects are part of. And by making it consumable by those ecosystem communities, they can kind of then figure out, well, how can I take this thing and apply it to what it is that we do here in PyPy or NPM or whatever. Now, having a standardized way to kind of represent certain metadata, I do believe that that would be useful, but I also believe that it's likely not a 1.0 thing, because we
Yeah,
ultimately will likely need to get all the ecosystems together, which ideally that would be one of the benefits, I think, that reaching out to OpenSSF could actually provide us, right? Because they have a lot of those relationships already with the ecosystem providers. Um, so once we get like the 1.0 and we start thinking about, well, what else can we or should we do with the spec? I think
yeah,
that's one of the things that they could probably help us with.
yeah.
That's
Okay.
my 2 cents anyway.
Yeah, I'm leaning toward that what you're saying here, that the ecosystem perspective needs more coordination,
Yeah.
or maybe some buy-in from the ecosystem people themselves. Across, like my impression is that there isn't much reason for different ecosystems to coordinate and talk in between them, and we could probably say that communities like OpenSSF could play a role in facilitating discussions like this. And I know that there was last year a conference, or maybe it was the year before that, called Packaging Con or something.
Yeah,
Where
yeah. Mhm.
so some people have already started talking about like this problem domain and trying to create connections and do the people networking kind of activities to see if we can do something together or solve problems that are common across ecosystems. Um, yeah, so I think I'm going to echo what you just said, and but that means requirement 5 is something we moved down to the parking lot.
Yeah.
And maybe just replace it with, or maybe it's not even, doesn't even need to be replaced, because the requirement is file must be both useful for project and ecosystem-centered communities. We don't need, just need to be relevant for projects. And then then we can talk instead of what kind of projects we have out there that are open source, and most of them have a reasonably common shape, in my opinion. They have a central code repository of some sort where with the commit bit, limited access, and a reason for people to gather around this code and improve it, and thereby create a community. And then the consequences of having a community show up, that like, what do we do to increase and better the community and make people want to hang around and socialize. And like we have, for me, the community bits are usually the ones that make open source worth doing. Yeah, the free code is awesome, but you got to get to work on something that you care about, maybe, or something that you can be proud of, together with people who care about the same thing and want to be proud about the same thing, and that's huge. You don't. That's something I have not managed to find in a commercial setting almost ever, unless like the few people who started their own business, they get to do something like that. That's more the exception than the rule. So for us mortal peons who just code monkeys, we get to do open source instead and have to find enjoyment outside of work in the open source world, for example. And for the larger projects that have a language, for the language open source language communities, you get it even more consequences, because it's not just like an application anymore. It's actually it's a language. It's languages are super special in this open source world, so they need to be treated specially also. All right. So I think we're fine if we just move this off. That also frees us from a bunch of complexities and questions, so we can finish this project faster. I'll add a reason for why we move it down here later, so we can note it for posterity.
All right, sounds good.
And we can talk about hosts, and I'll fix the glossary later. And then we can move on. Okay, we spent half an hour now, 20 minutes on just doing meta stuff now. Okay, ecosystem hosts, or the ecosystem, people or communities, declares that the project has been taken under custodianship. That's the next point in our list of use cases. Now the question comes, if we say that the ecosystem perspective isn't something we care about, since we now said that the metadata file must both be useful in project and ecosystem-centric communities. Do we have to do considerations around force majeures, or like, for example, that somebody is taking over custodianship of a project, or that the project has been delisted for some reason? For example, it's been taken over by a hostile actor or something. Or the question of responsiveness. All of those questions, if we are now saying those are out of scope and something for version 1.1, we can simplify also by moving those to the parking lot. Does that sit well with you?
Yeah,
Like
I understand. So I'm trying to remember what the requirements in the CRA had to do with custodianship. Was that a requirement of the CRA, or
no?
No. Okay.
CRA
open source stewards were.
Yeah, stewards in this situation here are some kind of a middle man or middle organization. I don't know the word to use that. What's the organizational variant of middleman? Is there something?
Yeah.
That type of organization, which is more like, in my mind, this is, of course, not saying something definite about stewards is a little bit early, because a lot of people and communities are trying to figure out right now what that means. But as far as the Cyber Resilience Act is concerned, the steward is there to help make the open source projects that they are supporting to comply with the Cyber Resilience's light touch regime. They have a much lighter set of requirements, which in practice are opt-in. They are not enforced and they're not demanded. It's just something that they want to try to get open source communities to choose to participate in. And the way they do, as far as my understanding is, the way they have envisioned it is that they want projects to claim, if they want to, that their code and their project is intended for commercial use. And if they do so, then there's a list of things that they have to make sure is there, like a bunch of documentation, that they have a steward, that they have a contact point for security related issues, and a bunch more. So this is this, and as far as I understand, this is as far as the Cyber Resilience Act goes in a practical sense. There are more things to it, but those are like by side effects of the manufacturers having to start caring about their dependencies graph, which is very much like why I'm doing all of this right now, but that's more on how to help them make sensible decisions around what kind of software to base their projects on, or how to make sure that they get the benefits of open source continue if they choose to for many years to come, and that might require them to have some predictability when it comes to their component, their open source dependencies projects' ability to be responsive to incidents or vulnerabilities that are found, and asking somebody who works on the weekend to be responsive, there's something you cannot do just because, well, you don't have a contract. There's no employment going on there. You can ask nicely, and people have their full right to say no. But if they have some incentive, for example, we can help fund you, or we can continue using your project. I don't know. There's a lot of ways to incentivize developers. Then they might choose to opt in and then be part of this new regime. That's as far as I'm.
Got it.
That's
okay. Yeah. I think at some point, I think we're going to have to clearly define what commercial use means. But back to your original question on use case 9 and 10, for custodianship, this is kind of, I don't think this would be overly difficult. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think this, I don't think this is going to be overly hard to do. Use case 10 looks also very, very easy. However, this one, I believe, is going to require a little bit of research, because you could theoretically be within a single ecosystem. You could be delisted from one host, but not the other. And you also have,
that's a good point.
You also have situations where you might be delisted so that people cannot find you. However, they do it in a way where it doesn't break existing builds. So theoretically, you're still published, but you're not searchable anymore. So there's a lot of nuance and things to think about with 10.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's a kind of worms there.
Yeah. I think 9, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think 9 is completely doable.
Yeah, that's just somebody that's taking responsibility, but in a very limited way, and saying that I'm not taking over your project. I'm just making sure that we get a new release with this emergency patch included on behalf. And sometimes, like at least in the CPAN community, this is not something you do lightly. It's if the maintainer is still there and at least somewhat responsive, then they have to do it. It's their project. Nobody touches it. But in some circumstances, for example, for components that are far upstream inside the language ecosystem and has maybe hundreds or thousands of important dependents downstream, reverse dependencies.
Yep.
Then people will say, no, this needs to be fixed, and they have a way to do that by saying, we're doing we're fixing this problem upstream, even if the open source project owner or maintainer is unavailable. I don't know if this is easier possible in the different ecosystems. Actually, in CPAN, this is possible because every release, the account that does the releasing is part of the full name of the release. So you get a personal namespace attached to all the releases. And say if I make a release of some package I don't own, I can only release it under my name. And then there's a separate process that checks, am I allowed to publish under this package namespace under am I one of the what's the word for it? The publishers are the people who are allowed to publish. Then, if yes, it gets indexed and thereby visible for the world. If not, it will not even get indexed. I can still download my own version of the package if I know exactly the name and version. So in a sense, it's still made available, but you need to specifically ask for that package which I published. This is for me actually a pretty clever way of allowing people to do their things and create variations and make sure that code is published without stepping on people's toes. So pretty clever way of doing things, in my opinion. But the people who run this place, the hosts, they can just say, I'm going to publish something under my name, but I'm going to allow it to be indexed anyway, because they have the access to the user database in a sense. But they do it very sparingly. And so those people who are capable of doing something is a tiny group of people. And it's only used for emergency situations, as far as I understand. Okay, so custodianship is still, if we want to include custodianship in this list here, we need to figure out how is this communicated. That's a package is. Should this be a separate new way of communicating this, or should we leave it to the ecosystems themselves to figure out a way to do it, right? CPAN already has a way to do that, not explicitly, but implicitly, that you can discover by the fact that something ended up in the index. And so, but you can't upfront declare that this project is has been taken under custodianship, unless the people who take it under custodianship also say that they are looking for new maintainers, for example. So there's a separate metadata field for that. It's the package is open for adoption, but it's still I'm not entirely sure of the details of this mechanism, but that's roughly something like that, which works here on CPAN at least.
And again, if this becomes too difficult, I mean, 10 is going to be, that's a can of worms, but 9, if it becomes too difficult and it's really blocking us from getting 1.0 out, let's just punt it to 1.1. I asked about the CRA specifically because I think that 1.0 needs to address any kind of use cases that would come up as they pertain to the CRA.
Yeah. Let's see if we can find the X. I don't remember. Give me a second. Yeah, I'm gonna put an X on 10 just so we do it immediately. I think we should put an X. Okay, let's. Okay, I have tried to figure out if there's a good way to allow ecosystems to attach or communicate metadata like this. And right now I'm thinking maybe this is not something that we should have an opinion on, because they know how their ecosystem is working. We can urge people to make that kind of information available, but it's probably going to have to be integrated in the tooling somehow. And I don't know, it's so difficult.
You know, I think we've make it, I think we make it like a way where you can declare that, you know, custodianship is now managed by X, and this entity, and it could be the maintainer, it could be the ecosystem, is making the claim. And if you leave it open like that, I mean, the ecosystem host can do it, the maintainer can do it, doesn't really matter, right? You have, you basically have the citation available for who's making that statement.
Okay, but in that case, where would we expect that statement to be found in such a way that downstream that we can consume that statement and make some?
It depends where the file lives, right? If the file lives in the repo, right, in the source code repository, then, you know, the maintainer of that thing can make that statement themselves. The ecosystem wouldn't actually be able to, because they typically wouldn't have rights to be able to do that. Now, if the file was published on the ecosystem, right, maybe like an NPM or PyPy or something like that, then the ecosystem could, in fact, you know, make these statements. So it really, I think, depends on where it ultimately ends up living.
That's specifically what I'm asking for. In the last case you just mentioned there, I think we need to have at least some clear way to a recommendation of what that file is and where you can find it, or what it's called, or something that makes it implementable somehow. And right now, at least on CPAN, we have one file that we are always downloading, and that's the tarball, the artifact itself. And anything inside there is not touched. It's completely the same as the author uploaded it. We do unpack it and figure out if there's something funny is going on there. If it, for example, unpacks into a separate directory, if file system rights are not insane, and a bunch of other checks, sanity checks, just so we can get a clear idea of that a package that is being uploaded doesn't break any tooling downstream, or any of the processes that are needed. And by convention, as far as I know, we also take the README file and the meta YAML file, which is the metadata file that has been generated by the tooling we use to create packages. Those are taken out of the tarball and then published alongside the tarball separately. But I'm not entirely sure if it's ever downloaded. That I don't know. I don't think so. And sure, we could, and if others do something similar, the question is, how would we, should we just leave it up to the tooling developers to just figure it out? Like, or the ecosystem people to figure it out? Or should we say that we recommend that we don't have an extra file called ecosystem, dot ecosystem as a surname, or dot messages, or I don't know, something that includes some metadata or the metadata that the ecosystem folks have published regarding a particular project or release. And for me, that's still a can of worms, even if it's a pretty simple case, like these packages under custodianship.
Yeah, I think, you bring up some good points. It's one thing to create a spec. It's another thing to, provide some best practices and guidance on how to use it.
Yeah, it kind of has to be implementable.
Right, exactly. And that's one of the reasons why we decided to create like the CycloneDX authoritative guides series, right? We've got multiple guides that, go beyond just what the spec says. How do you actually do this in the real world? Maybe once we get the spec complete, maybe that's like the next thing that we do, right? Maybe we create some guides on how maintainers can actually use this, or how ecosystems can theoretically adopt this. I think we're going to be doing something similar with the CLE, by the way, common life cycle enumeration. Yeah, because we can, as an ECMA standard, right, we can publish a standard itself, but we can also publish supplemental material, either with the standard or, outside of it. So, we do it outside of it with CycloneDX, kind of undecided whether or not we're going to publish a guide that's part of this. I mean, going to be hosted on ECMA along with the standard itself for CLE, still to be undetermined. But even in the case of T, right, we're publishing the specification, which obviously is a PDF document, but we're also publishing the schemas, and those are also going to live with the spec itself on ECMA. So we can do it a couple of different ways, but the point being is I think we need some guidance.
Yep. All right. I'll put an X on use case 9 here.
Okay.
So we're punting it and maybe offer some guidance of some sort if we find that's in scope or necessary.
Okay.
The same next one, ecosystem host has been deemed the project maintainer to be unresponsive. That's super useful to know, but it's also transitional. And if we don't have a clear idea on how this is to be communicated, then we should put an X on that one also and just punt it until later.
Yeah.
Now, if let's say, for example, we publish this and people start using it, and the ecosystem folks in different ecosystems, they figure out that we maybe should try to have a standard way of communicating these things in the same way projects do. Then having some thoughts available in this documentation can at least make that process easier to go to move forward. But we don't have these people here with us, and I've tried to reach out to a bunch of people, but in the PHP community, in my own community, and a little bit in the talk with one of the folks in the Python community to see like if there's something we can unpack and have a conversation around. And this is not on their radar, and this is too far in the future. Like, and we're trying to solve a problem which some people seem to think is a nice to have. I would disagree, but this is important for open source projects to be able to communicate these kind of things. But maybe we also need to sell in the idea, also spend some time on that, do some what's the word for it? Preparing the community for and asking the right questions in the right forums to say, this is a problem, we should need to think about it. But that means also use case 11 is next to it, gets the next to it. If we're going to continue with this train of thought.
Yeah.
Okay, for the Norwegian user interface. So we are 4 minutes before time, so I think we can, I can say a little bit of the other things I've added lately, and this is just to clear up my mind, and hopefully others also, maybe yours. I've added a few appendixes. I don't think we talked much about that yet.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to figure out, we're talking about what kind of support is an open source project might request. And a lot of people are wondering what the support is being provided by an open source project. All the users are interested in this column here. Oops. And too few are thinking of the last column here. And I'm thinking, what kind of, to get an idea of what kind of efforts with the different types of activities require, like time horizon, effort horizon, or the what kind of promises, like I will support this for the next few years, and what do we get for that? I'm not sure if this is a productive line of thought, but so maybe we just remove those appendices later. So I'm thinking aloud to see if this triggers some thoughts with you.
No, it makes sense to me. So yeah.
So that's one aspect, one perspective. Next one is expected time investment we should have from the different levels that we would claim. Something is unmaintained, that means there's no time invested. We should expect no time being invested. And minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years. And furthermore, downstream here, expected response time. How fast should we expect people to be and under which circumstances should we expect fast or be okay with slow response? Just to get an idea of my point here is to get an idea of expectation levels for users and maintainers, so that when they pick one, they get an idea of a common idea with the users of what they mean with that. Right now, calling something casually maintained, there's no definition for what casual means here. It could be anything. So for me, that means okay, a little bit of clarity, but there's a few more lists like this, which I'm trying to wrap my brain around here. And I'll see if I can add those for the next meeting. And if you find the time to browse through this document again by next meeting, so we can have some good discussions, that would be awesome.
All right.
Yeah, I think we have come pretty far. We basically have just a few more use cases left, and we might need to think a little, think of a few more use cases, because I will be adding a few more for the next time, so we can at least cover the important bases. And taking that will mostly likely be moving stuff from my own notes on the CPAN security website. So we'll see how that goes. I think we can put this line underneath here for the meeting.
Very good.
Awesome.
All right, Solveig. Great call.
Thank
Thank you.
thank
All
you.
right.
Thank
Cheers.
you. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.